Every secure connection you make, logging into your bank, sending an email, trading cryptocurrency, is protected by cryptography. These systems rely on complex mathematical locks that are virtually impossible for ordinary computers to force open. This graph illustrates the hardware required to break those locks. For decades, experts knew a mathematical formula called Shor's algorithm could theoretically crack these systems using a quantum computer. Early estimates projected this required a machine with 20 million quantum bits, or qubits. That 20 million figure was so massive compared to existing technology that it acted as a psychological safety net for the cybersecurity world. Organizations treated quantum decryption as a distant, abstract problem that would take engineers 30 or 40 years of physical hardware development to solve. Then the math changed. The timeline for a working quantum attack didn't accelerate because someone built a giant physical machine. It accelerated because researchers figured out how to optimize the software running on the hardware we already have. In a series of published papers, researchers at Google applied clever algorithmic tricks to streamline the mathematical operations. The hardware requirement to break RSA encryption plummeted from 20 million qubits to fewer than 1 million. Then, applying similar optimizations to the cryptography securing Bitcoin pushed the requirement down to fewer than 500,000 qubits. The immense hardware barrier protecting the global digital economy is rapidly shrinking. Because progress is being driven purely by smarter algorithms, the decades of padding the security industry thought it had is vanishing in real time. If the updated mathematical blueprint only calls for 500,000 qubits, you might wonder why hostile actors haven't assembled a working weapon to drain cryptocurrency wallets. The answer lies in the specific type of qubit the software requires. The algorithms published by Google's team rely on roughly 1,200 logical qubits. A logical qubit is a perfect, mathematically stable information unit that never makes a calculation error. Nature does not provide perfect logical qubits. Quantum states are incredibly fragile. A physical qubit can be disrupted by a microscopic temperature change, a tiny vibration, or a stray cosmic ray, immediately destroying the information it holds. To create stability, physicists use a technique called error correction. This diagram illustrates engineers grouping hundreds of volatile physical qubits into a single grid, constantly measuring and correcting mistakes to simulate one perfect logical qubit. Applying this massive ratio to the 1,200 required logical qubits, the grid multiplies outward to reach 500,000 physical qubits. That 500,000 figure is not a random guess. It is a precise, conservative calculation mapped directly to the proven error correction math on the hardware architectures that exist today. There is, however, a steep drop-off between a theoretical blueprint and a machine in a laboratory. The current state-of-the-art is much smaller. Google's most recently verified hardware, a processor named Willow, operates with roughly 105 physical qubits. This scale model highlights the disparity. A 105-unit array on the left is a microscopic sliver compared to the sprawling 500,000-unit facility grid required to break Bitcoin's encryption. Crossing that gap requires clearing monumental engineering hurdles. Scaling up manufacturing is difficult, but the hardest problem is sustained operation. A quantum processor must run these decryption algorithms flawlessly for up to 20 minutes without a single cascading error causing the system to crash. A peer-reviewed paper proves that cracking these encryption systems is mathematically possible. But an algorithmic blueprint does not equal an executable weapon for an adversary today. Even with those hardware limitations, the operational runtime detailed in these new algorithms introduces a pressing vulnerability. On a fast clock quantum machine, the math to break Bitcoin's encryption takes approximately 9 minutes to execute. Bitcoin's network takes an average of 10 minutes to verify a block of transactions. A 9-minute attack window means a fast quantum computer could theoretically calculate a user's private key and steal their funds while their transaction is still sitting unconfirmed on the network. The danger extends far beyond cryptocurrency. Cybersecurity experts are mobilizing against a tactic with much broader implications, known as harvest now, decrypt later. Hostile intelligence agencies and criminal organizations don't need a working quantum computer to start their attacks. They simply intercept heavily encrypted emails, bank transfers, and government cables today. They store that unreadable data in massive server farms, waiting for the physical hardware to finally catch up to the software blueprints. This dynamic is triggering immediate institutional panic. Major web infrastructure companies like Cloudflare and government agencies like the National Institute of Standards and Technology have abruptly pulled their internal post-quantum migration deadlines forward to 2029 and 2030 to mitigate this exposure. Because our current digital secrets are already being captured for future decryption, the countdown for quantum risk didn't start the day a 500,000 qubit machine gets built. The clock started the moment these optimized algorithms proved the attack was possible. There is a persistent industry fear that the massive server farms securing modern blockchains will be rendered obsolete by quantum processors. This anxiety assumes that quantum machines will eventually outpace classical hardware at SHA-256 computation. This is the hashing fallacy, the belief that quantum speedups apply with equal efficiency to every cryptographic problem. Proof-of-work network consensus remains secure due to the specific nature of hashing algorithms. Because these functions require a brute force search, quantum hardware lacks a mathematical shortcut to find a solution faster than specialized mining chips. Vulnerability concentrates specifically on the digital signatures used to prove individual ownership. To find the actual point of failure, we have to look past the network consensus and focus on how a wallet enforces control over its assets. Modern accounts rely on the elliptic curve discrete logarithm problem, or ECDLP. This mathematical foundation is what secures the relationship between your public and private keys. In March 2026, researchers at Google Quantum AI publish a paper revising the resource requirements needed to break these 256-bit elliptic curves. Their analysis suggests that a machine with roughly 1,200 logical qubits could crack the code. That is a 20-fold reduction over previous scientific estimates. This hardware would expose 4 critical layers of the blockchain stack: consensus signatures, data availability commitments, account signatures, and application layer zero-knowledge proofs. The primary risk factor for any specific asset is the visibility of its public key. The exact moment that key appears on the public ledger determines the window of opportunity for an attack. To map the threat, we have to distinguish between 2 different cryptographic primitives: hash functions like SHA-256 and elliptic curve cryptography like SEC-P256K1. When a quantum computer attacks SHA-256, it uses Grover's algorithm, searching the dataset one step at a time, yielding minimal gains. But attacking SEC-P256K1 signatures requires Shor's algorithm, offering an exponential speedup that solves the discrete logarithm directly, isolating a private key instantly. This asymmetry means a quantum computer is incapable of taking over the mining network, but it can effortlessly forge a digital signature. While the overarching security of the network is stable, the ownership model of every individual wallet is now completely vulnerable to Shor's algorithm. Shor's algorithm has one critical dependency. It requires the target's public key to derive the private key. Vulnerability is dictated by how much information the user has shared with the ledger. Legacy Bitcoin addresses used P2PK scripts, which record the user's raw public key directly on the blockchain the moment they receive funds. This creates a permanent target. Roughly 1.7 million Bitcoin are locked in these legacy scripts, including original Satoshi-era rewards. Subject to an at-rest attack, the visible public key gives an attacker using a slow clock quantum architecture months to derive the key offline. Modern protocol standards like pay-to-public key hash or SegWit operate differently. These protocols hide the public key behind a cryptographic hash. This hash acts as a one-way shield that is naturally resistant to quantum analysis. As long as a modern address has never broadcasted a transaction, the public key remains hidden, leaving the asset effectively invisible to a quantum computer. That shield is temporarily lowered the moment a user spends their funds. To verify the transaction, the wallet must broadcast the public key to the public mempool. This triggers an on-spend attack. An adversary captures the public key from the mempool and attempts to resolve the private key before the network records the transaction. This is a race. Slow clock quantum architectures cannot compute the answer fast enough. The attacker needs a fast clock architecture, such as a superconducting processor. Current hardware estimates suggest a superconducting machine will derive a private key in roughly 9 minutes. We can measure that 9-minute window against the Bitcoin network's average 10-minute block interval. Because block times vary, a 9-minute derivation speed creates a 41% risk of a successful theft before the original transaction is finalized. Once the key is derived, the attacker broadcasts a forged transaction with a higher fee. This forces a replace-by-fee bidding war. The theft succeeds because miners are economically incentivized to prioritize the higher fee. They record the attacker's transaction into the blockchain first, rendering the original owner's funds effectively gone. Development teams are already architecting defenses. The Ethereum Foundation has established a dedicated post-quantum security team to run interoperability testing on new network clients. The planned transition involves adopting hash-based signatures, like Lean XMSS, to replace validator signatures with a quantum-safe alternative. A critical part of this roadmap is EIP 8141, which introduces native account abstraction. This allows individual accounts to choose their own signature verification scheme. This signature agility allows users to migrate to quantum-safe wallets on their own schedule, without waiting for a protocol-wide hard fork to be finalized. For active users, technical safety is achievable through software updates and the migration of assets to these new standards. This leaves a permanent vulnerability for dormant assets, specifically the 1.7 million Bitcoin held in legacy P2PK scripts. Because the private keys for many of these Satoshi-era coins are lost, the owners cannot authorize a migration. These assets remain fixed on the ledger, awaiting hardware capable of mathematically deriving the keys to these static addresses. These addresses represent a high-value target that forces a collision between the ledger's immutability and its economic stability. Governments and communities are now considering digital salvage policies, deciding whether to destroy or regulate these dormant assets before they are seized by adversaries. Quantum computing introduces a mechanism for the systematic mechanical harvesting of crypto's oldest and most valuable abandoned bounties. We often visualize quantum computers as quiet engines of physics, operating in isolation. But in practice, active error correction creates a violent data firehose that threatens to overwhelm the classical systems supporting it. In the laboratory, quantum error correction has reached a state of physical feasibility. We can now group physical qubits to detect and suppress noise in real time. Scaling this progress into a functional, fault-tolerant quantum computer requires classical hardware that scales in tandem with the quantum processor. The decoder's sustained throughput, mu, must stay ahead of the syndrome arrival rate, lambda. A logical qubit generates a continuous stream of error syndromes. If the decoder cannot process one block before the next arrives, a backlog accumulates. If that backlog grows unchecked, the classical pipeline stalls. Without timely corrections, the quantum state drifts toward decoherence. The evidence from these early systems suggests that fault tolerance has transitioned into a classical distributed systems challenge, where success is dictated by data path coordination and architectural efficiency. During Clifford-only operations, the system stays in a streaming regime. In this mode, the classical decoder can afford to lag slightly behind the quantum gates. The detected errors are simply recorded in a Pauli frame, a classical data structure that tracks the required corrections without pausing the quantum hardware. This flexibility ends when the algorithm requires a non-Clifford gate, such as a T-gate. This enters the synchronization regime. A T-gate requires feed-forward control. The classical Pauli frame must be fully resolved to determine the next physical operation. If the decoder is still processing a backlog of old data when it hits this barrier, the quantum processor must idle. During this classical stall, the data qubits are exposed to environmental noise. Every microsecond of decoder delay allows new physical errors to accumulate. These idle errors increase the effective error rate. If the lag is long enough, the noise level can cross the breaking point of the error-correcting code. To maintain the quantum state, the classical decoder must sustain a zero backlog state throughout the computation. The requirements for this classical stack vary by platform. The superconducting architecture uses a surface code, which creates a high-speed sprint. Because superconducting qubits have short coherence times, the entire error correction cycle must complete in approximately 1 microsecond. This chart shows CPU mean decode latency for the minimum weight perfect matching algorithm. The red line represents the 1 microsecond deadline. At small code distances, like 3 or 7, CPUs process syndromes in time. As distance scales, they cross the failure line before distance 17. However, average processing speed is not the primary risk. The real threat is tail latency, measured at the 99th percentile. Occasionally, a complex pattern of errors requires significantly more computation. This creates a massive latency spike that exceeds the cycle budget. A single spike in tail latency forces all subsequent data into a queue. This creates the backlog that triggers a synchronization stall. CPUs cannot guarantee the deterministic, bounded response times needed to suppress these latency tails. In a superconducting system, tail latency is the metric that determines if the quantum processor stays synchronized. A different approach utilizes neutral atom arrays and quantum low-density parity check codes. These QLDPC codes are highly efficient. As shown here, they require significantly fewer physical data qubits to protect a logical qubit than standard surface codes. A 144-qubit code provides robust protection using only a fraction of the equivalent hardware. Neutral atom cycles are roughly 1,000 times slower, providing a 1 millisecond window. However, the decoding algorithms for these codes, specifically belief propagation and ordered statistics, are computationally intensive. Using a CPU against the 1 millisecond deadline fails, as complex matrix operations cause the CPU's tail latency to reach 10 times the average. Moving this workload to a GPU changes the dynamic. Its parallel architecture processes these matrices comfortably within the millisecond budget. Batching the data through a GPU bounds the computation time, taming the tail latency spikes and keeping the quantum processor stabilized. Slower quantum hardware provides more time for classical logic, but it requires much higher computational density to manage the increased code complexity. The lessons from both hardware platforms show that no single classical processor can resolve the decoding bottleneck on its own. Building a real-time stack requires a heterogeneous architecture, where different classical components are assigned to specific timing constraints. Superconducting systems require field-programmable gate arrays. These chips provide the deterministic speed needed to meet sub-microsecond deadlines and eliminate latency tails. Neutral atom systems, handling complex QLDPC codes, rely on integrated GPUs to process massive parallel message passing algorithms. The CPU's role shifts to high-level orchestration, managing logical schedules and the Pali frame memory, while the specialized accelerators handle the syndrome data. This formula defines the speed of a logical quantum computer. The final term, the sum of synchronization latency, is the variable that determines the overall performance. If the classical stack is not optimized to minimize this latency, logical operations stall, and algorithm runtimes expand from days to years. The timeline for useful quantum computing depends on the integration of these classical subsystems. While qubit coherence defines the error budget, the architecture and throughput of the classical stack determine the speed of the computation. We have a hard deadline for the security of the internet. The timeline for quantum computers to break the encryption protecting digital payments and communications has abruptly moved up to 2029. This chart shows the estimated hardware required to crack elliptic curve cryptography. Notice the precipitous drop here in the 2026 data. Google Quantum AI figured out how to break this encryption with a 20-fold reduction in resources, bringing the requirement down to under 1,200 logical qubits and 90 million Toffoli gates. Because this math directly threatens global financial systems, the researchers withheld the actual quantum circuits from their white paper. They couldn't risk giving attackers an instruction manual. But they still needed to prove the math was real. So they used a tool called SP1 from Succinct to generate a zero-knowledge proof. This allowed anyone to cryptographically verify the vulnerability exists without exposing the underlying design. Proving this took a massive coordinated effort. Google pulled in cryptographers from the Ethereum Foundation, UC Berkeley, and Stanford to validate the findings. The publication of this proof establishes the quantum threat as an immediate, unavoidable infrastructure deadline. For active cryptocurrency users, surviving this deadline is fairly straightforward. When networks upgrade to post-quantum cryptography, or PQC, you just manually migrate your funds to a new secure wallet. The real crisis lies with the billions of dollars trapped in lost, abandoned, or permanently dormant wallets. This pie chart illustrates a major blockchain's total circulating supply. That massive slice represents wallets that cannot voluntarily upgrade themselves, including lost early adopter keys and the billions held in Satoshi's original stash. If a quantum computer cracks the old encryption on those specific dormant wallets, an attacker can seize those massive liquidity pools, flood the market, and wipe out the network's entire economy. This forces a brutal choice. Networks have to either step in to stop this theft or stick strictly to their founding rule of absolute immutability. To guarantee the financial survival of the blockchain, developers will have to break the exact promise of uncensorable property that gave the network its value in the first place. The first governance option is to refuse a hard fork entirely and leave all dormant legacy wallets exactly as they are. This approach is rooted in the strict ethos that code is law. According to this strict ideological view, no central authority should ever have the power to alter ownership, period. This comparison matrix lets us evaluate the trade-offs of this approach. Choosing to do nothing offers high ethos protection, but pairs it with catastrophic economic risk. The moment a bad actor successfully forges the first legacy signature using a quantum computer, it triggers a devastating, unstoppable bank run across the ecosystem. Doing nothing maintains ideological purity perfectly, right up until the exact minute the network's economy is wiped out forever. The second option is to execute a network-wide hard fork that permanently freezes or burns all unmigrated wallets by a strict deadline. Looking back at the matrix, we see starkly opposing trade-offs. A freeze or burn gives you high economic security, but results in severe ethos destruction. By destroying the vulnerable assets before a quantum computer can access them, the network mathematically protects the active circulating supply and neutralizes the threat of a sudden dumping event. But the collateral damage is severe. Legitimate heirs, long-term institutional holders, and anyone who simply misses the deadline will watch network consensus unilaterally destroy their legal property. A forced burn secures the network's financial future by definitively proving that property on the blockchain can be seized. The third option attempts a middle ground. A protocol-level mandate automatically sweeps all vulnerable, dormant assets into a secure, quantum-resistant multi-sig vault. When we add digital salvage to the matrix, we see its unique complications: moderate economic security alongside extreme governance friction. The core benefit here is that the network's total value is shielded from attackers, while theoretically leaving a pathway open for legitimate owners to claim their funds later. However, this new approach creates a massive new vulnerability, a multi-billion-dollar centralized honeypot that is completely controlled by human governance. This creates a political nightmare regarding which specific entities hold signing authority for the collective funds. Plus, once the funds are migrated, it becomes nearly impossible to cryptographically prove legitimate ownership of a lost wallet. Digital salvage merely delays the crisis. It trades an objective mathematical vulnerability for a chaotic, subjective governance mess. High-level regulatory bodies are already engaging with researchers to track these systemic risks, meaning the fallout of these network forks will have serious macroeconomic stakes. This graphic maps a cultural spectrum for how blockchains will react, from ideological purity to economic pragmatism. Purity networks face internal civil wars and volatility over forced upgrades. Pragmatic networks swiftly execute a freeze to protect network health, alienating purists. There is no universal, painless solution here. Survival requires every single community to intentionally sacrifice a core piece of its founding ethos. The zero-knowledge proof recently published by Google and Succinct sets a definitive countdown timer for the entire blockchain industry. The quantum mathematics threatening these networks are silent and objective. The human consensus required to defend against them will be loud, chaotic, and messy. Developers, investors, and node operators have to look closely at their networks today and evaluate which specific compromise their community is actually prepared to make. The migration to post-quantum cryptography will be the ultimate test of decentralized governance. It will finally determine whether code truly is law, or if financial survival dictates otherwise.